March 1944, Northern Italy, 15:27 hours. The hillside was too exposed. Terrace stone walls cut across the slope in broken lines, olive trees scattered unevenly between shell craters. The Allied advance had stalled just short of a shallow ridgeline overlooking a narrow valley road. From that ridge, German observers had clear line of sight. The first mortar round landed without warning. It struck behind the platoon's forward position, showering dirt and rock fragments into foxholes not yet fully reinforced. A second round followed seconds later, walking closer to the only narrow path leading back down the hill. The withdrawal route. By the third impact, the path was gone. Rock and debris collapsed across it in a cloud of dust. A mule team carrying ammunition never made it past the bend. Communications wires snapped along the ground as shrapnel tore through exposed sections. The platoon was pinned halfway up a slope, with no lateral cover and no reliable radio contact. German mortar teams had found the range. Rounds began landing in disciplined sequence, creeping upward in small increments. Dirt sprayed across helmets. One man shouted for a corpsman. Another dragged a wounded sergeant behind a stone terrace wall that offered barely knee-high protection. The lieutenant tried to reach battalion by field phone. Deadline. The situation was clear. Stay in place and absorb artillery, or attempt a chaotic retreat down a path already under observation. Then the mortar fire shifted slightly left, probing for movement. The Germans were not firing blindly. They were adjusting. Panic moves quickly on open ground. Men glanced backward instinctively, calculating escape routes that no longer existed. A squad leader shouted for smoke, but the wind carried it thinly across the slope, revealing more than concealing. The lieutenant made the decision. Pull back by teams, slow, use terraces. The withdrawal would be staggered, 2 men moving while others provided covering fire. It was risky, but remaining meant eventual collapse under sustained indirect fire. The first pair moved. Mortar rounds adjusted instantly. The Germans had observers watching. That's when one infantryman, private first class, rifle slung low, dust streaking his face, looked up the hill rather than down. He understood something others hadn't yet. The mortar fire was precise, but it hesitated whenever return fire intensified. Not because it inflicted casualties, but because it suggested presence. If the Germans believed the slope remained strongly defended, they would slow their infantry advance. Slow meant time. Time meant survival. As the second withdrawal pair prepared to move, the soldier leaned toward the lieutenant. "Sir, I can stay." The lieutenant stared at him, confused for a second. "To do what?" The soldier didn't answer directly. He checked his ammunition. Then he looked at the abandoned upper foxholes, still overlooking the ridge. He wasn't volunteering to fight to the last man. He was volunteering to be heard. The mortar fire cut the platoon off. But the Germans hadn't seen how many Americans were left. And sometimes, in war, what the enemy believes matters more than what exists. The platoon began to slip downward, 2 at a time. The soldiers stayed. Not to win the hill, but to make it sound impossible to take. By 15:39 hours, the platoon was halfway down the shattered slope. They moved in broken rhythm, 2 men sliding behind terrace walls, another pair sprinting low between olive trees. Mortar rounds still fell, but their pattern had shifted slightly upward. The Germans were bracketing the top, because someone was still firing. From the uppermost foxhole, a rifle cracked sharply, 3 quick shots spaced just far enough apart to suggest coordination rather than panic. Dust kicked near the ridge crest where a German observer had been adjusting range. Then silence. 30 seconds later, fire erupted again, this time from 10 meters to the right. The private had moved. He didn't stay in one position long enough to be fixed. After firing a short, deliberate burst, he rolled low behind a stone wall, sprinted 2 terraces down, then climbed back up behind another abandoned firing point. He wasn't trying to hit targets consistently. He was trying to create pattern. German mortar observers rely on rhythm, on identifying where return fire originates and adjusting accordingly. But the rhythm now suggested multiple rifles operating independently. One shot from the far left, another from center, a third, slower, deliberate, near the olive grove. The German lieutenant, watching from the ridge, frowned. He had expected the slope to collapse quickly once the withdrawal route was cut. Mortars had landed cleanly, debris had blocked retreat. Yet return fire persisted. And it was shifting. "Mehr Feuer nach oben," he ordered, more fire higher up. Mortar teams adjusted again, creeping rounds across terraces that were now empty. Below, the American platoon gained ground. Men reached the bend where the path had collapsed and began clearing loose rock just enough to slip through. A wounded corporal was passed carefully between shoulders. Up top, the private changed tactics. He found a light machine gun abandoned beside a fallen gunner. He didn't try to carry it far, just enough to reposition behind a partial stone barrier. He fired a short, controlled burst downslope. The sound was unmistakable. Automatic fire suggests strength. He let it echo briefly across the valley, then stopped. 2 minutes later, he fired again, but from a slightly lower angle. To the German observers, it now sounded like a reinforced defensive line refusing to break. Mortar rounds intensified briefly, but then paused. Pause means reassessment. Reassessment means hesitation. And hesitation buys minutes. At 15:52 hours, German infantry began preparing to advance cautiously, slower than planned. Instead of immediate push, they reorganized behind ridge cover, expecting resistance in depth. The private heard boots shifting above. He did not wait to be overrun. He moved again, back to the highest terrace, firing 3 deliberate shots that snapped against ridge stone. Not desperate. Not frantic. Disciplined. He wanted them to believe the slope still held a platoon-sized defense. Below him, the last American squad disappeared around the lower bend. The lieutenant glanced back once, expecting to see no one. But the rifle cracked again from above. The Germans had cut off the platoon. But they were advancing as if facing a company. And on that hillside in Italy, sound was more powerful than numbers. At 16:03 hours, German infantry began their advance. Not aggressively, carefully. Squads moved in short rushes from ridge cover to shallow depressions, expecting immediate counterfire from multiple American positions. Their officer signaled for bounding movement, 2 men advancing while others covered. Because from their perspective, the hillside was still defended. A rifle cracked from the upper terrace again. Then another shot, lower this time. A burst from the machine gun followed seconds later, sharp and controlled. The German lieutenant dropped instinctively, pressing against stone. He had counted at least 3 distinct firing points in the last 5 minutes. That implied depth. It implied reserves. Langsam, he warned slowly. Instead of charging downhill to exploit mortar success, they flattened into cautious formation. Mortar fire resumed briefly, but now it walked carefully around suspected defensive pockets rather than blanketing the slope indiscriminately. The German commander did not want to risk friendly casualties if his infantry was closing on entrenched Americans. That adjustment was everything. Above the terraces, the private shifted again. He no longer needed volume. He needed spacing. One shot every 30 seconds. Then silence. Then two shots from a different angle. He moved constantly, never remaining long enough for advancing troops to triangulate precisely. Dust and smoke helped blur visual confirmation. Olive trees cast broken shadows in the late afternoon light. At one point, a German squad attempted to rush a suspected firing position. They found it empty. But before they could signal success, a rifle cracked from behind and above them, suggesting overlapping coverage. They withdrew to reassess. The private could hear their voices now, closer, tense. He was not trying to inflict casualties. His aim was selective. He fired near rocks, near ridge stone, loud enough to snap past ears and reinforce the illusion of defensive depth. Below, the last American soldier slipped beyond the lower ridgeline. The lieutenant, now safely out of direct observation, counted heads. All present, except one. Up the hill, the private's ammunition was thinning. He checked his remaining rounds carefully, enough for one final sequence. He waited for a full minute, no fire at all. Silence can be unsettling. Then, deliberately, he unleashed the machine gun again, longer burst this time, sweeping across terrace line before abandoning the position entirely. The Germans froze. The burst sounded like reinforcement had arrived. It bought him the final margin. As shadows lengthened across the slope, the private slid down through terraces he had climbed all afternoon. He did not run. He moved in slow, controlled descent, using terrain folds and lingering smoke to mask his retreat. When German infantry finally reached the highest terrace in strength, they found empty foxholes, scattered brass casings, and no organized resistance. They had advanced cautiously against a defense that no longer existed. The mortars had cut the platoon off, but hesitation had cut the German momentum instead. And the soldier who stayed behind had already disappeared into dusk. By 18 hours, the hillside was quiet. German infantry moved cautiously across the upper terraces, rifles raised, expecting a final ambush from concealed positions. They found overturned ammunition boxes, scattered brass casings, and the light machine gun abandoned beside a stone wall. No bodies. No wounded left behind. No defensive line. The mortar officer climbed down from the ridge to inspect personally. He studied the spread of shell impacts and the shifting firing points identified during the engagement. It didn't add up. The pattern of return fire had suggested at least a reinforced platoon, possibly more, yet there were not enough footprints, not enough equipment, not enough drag marks to account for sustained resistance. One German NCO pointed at the terraces. He moved, he said quietly. Back and forth. Up and down. The mortar officer stared at the slope again. They had not been fighting numbers. They had been fighting noise. Below the ridge, the American platoon regrouped in a shallow depression shielded from direct observation. The lieutenant counted again. All squads accounted for. Wounded stabilized. Still one missing. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the valley. German forces did not pursue aggressively. Their caution lingered. They reorganized on the captured slope, expecting counterattack that never came. At 18:07 hours, movement appeared along the lower terraces. Slow. Controlled. One figure. The private walked down the last stretch of broken path alone, rifle slung, helmet dusty, face streaked with sweat and powder residue. He did not run into camp. He simply stepped into the depression where the platoon waited. The lieutenant looked at him for a long second. How many were up there? He asked quietly. The private shrugged once. Just me, sir. There was no dramatics in his tone. No attempt at heroics. He hadn't charged machine guns. He hadn't held the hill by force. He had understood something simpler. The enemy advances cautiously when uncertain. Uncertainty can be manufactured. German mortars had collapsed the only withdrawal route. But German infantry never exploited it. They slowed. They redeployed. They hesitated. Because one soldier stayed behind on purpose, not to fight, but to be heard. The hillside cost no additional American lives that afternoon. Not because firepower shifted, but because perception did. When darkness fully settled over the Italian valley, both sides occupied different ridgelines. One believed they had advanced against significant resistance. The other knew a single rifle had rewritten the tempo of battle. He had won the fight without being seen. And in war, sometimes invisibility is stronger than force. By nightfall, both sides wrote reports. On the German side, the mortar officer summarized the action clinically. Enemy position neutralized, advance conducted under intermittent resistance, opposition dispersed before full assault. There was no mention of confusion. No note about the phantom firing line. Only a quiet acknowledgement that infantry had encountered stubborn delaying fire from multiple points along the slope. The mortar calculations had been correct. The range had been precise. What they had misjudged was volume. They had assumed resistance equaled manpower. On the American side, the after-action report was equally restrained. Withdrawal executed under indirect fire. One enlisted man remained temporarily to provide covering fire. Platoon regrouped successfully. Temporarily. The word did not capture what had actually occurred. The private sat with the rest of the platoon near a low stone wall, cleaning dust from his rifle in near darkness. His hands moved automatically. No one hovered around him. No one clapped him on the back. Infantrymen rarely celebrate moments like that. They understand how thin the margin was. If the Germans had rushed aggressively instead of reorganizing. If one mortar round had landed slightly lower. If the machine gun had jammed. The illusion would have collapsed instantly. But war often hinges on seconds of hesitation. And that hesitation had been manufactured deliberately. The lieutenant approached quietly. "You could have come down earlier," he said. The private nodded once. "Yes, sir." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. He had watched the mortar pattern shift when return fire intensified. He had heard German boots halt when shots snapped overhead. He had felt how silence unsettled them more than steady firing. He understood something most soldiers learn slowly. Noise shapes decisions. The Germans believed they faced depth, overlapping rifles, shifting defense, possibly reinforcement. So they slowed. Slowing forfeits initiative. Forfeiting initiative saves lives on the other side. No medal was issued that evening, no speech given. But the platoons slept intact. Wounded treated. No one missing. The slope that should have become a trap had turned into a delay. And delay had been enough. In Italy in 1944, battles were rarely decided by dramatic charges or cinematic last stands. More often, they were shaped by small, disciplined acts that shifted tempo. The private had not stayed to win glory. He had stayed to control perception. He had turned one rifle into a reinforced line. He had turned hesitation into survival. When historians study campaigns, they track divisions, brigades, artillery numbers. They rarely note the single soldier who chose to stay behind. But that afternoon on a terraced hillside, German mortars cut a platoon off. And one infantryman stayed on purpose. Not to fight harder. but to make the enemy think twice. Sometimes that is enough to win. Dark settled slowly over the Italian hills. By 1910 hours, the valley had turned blue-gray, the terraces little more than layered shadows. German activity on the captured slope diminished to scattered movement and low conversation. No renewed assault came. No probing patrols descended toward the American position. They believed the defense had withdrawn in strength. Below the ridge, the American platoon remained silent. No fires, no talking above whispers. The lieutenant checked his watch more than once, saying nothing about the missing man. Everyone understood the margin. If the Germans had advanced aggressively before dusk, the illusion would have collapsed. If they had pressed downhill in force, one rifle would not have stopped them. But they hadn't, because uncertainty lingers longer than gunfire. At 19:34 hours, a single silhouette appeared against the upper terraces, moving deliberately, not running. The private kept to shadow lines, stepping where stone met earth, pausing whenever distant movement suggested observation. He descended the slope the same way he had climbed it, quietly, without drama. When he reached the platoon's position, no one cheered. There was no applause, no cinematic embrace. The lieutenant simply nodded once. All accounted for. That was enough. The private sat down, removed his helmet, and leaned back against a low stone wall. The adrenaline that had sustained him for hours drained slowly. His ears still rang from repeated rifle fire. His throat was dry from dust and smoke. He had not been heroic in the traditional sense. He had not charged. He had not held ground against overwhelming odds. He had stayed long enough to convince the enemy they faced more than they did. And then he left before the illusion broke. Above them, the Germans consolidated their position cautiously, unaware the slope had been empty for nearly half an hour before they reached it. The platoon slept intact that night. No additional casualties. No missing men. The hill remained contested terrain. But the trap had failed. Not because of reinforcements. Not because of superior firepower. Because of hesitation. And hesitation had been engineered. Military historians often describe battles in terms of fire superiority, maneuver, and logistics. Mortar teams suppress. Infantry advances. Defensive lines collapse under pressure. On paper, that hillside engagement should have ended differently. German mortars successfully isolated the platoon. Observation was clear. Withdrawal route was cut. Communications were severed. Every textbook indicator pointed toward encirclement. But textbooks assume momentum. Momentum depends on certainty. The German infantry slowed because they believed they were facing a reinforced defensive position. They deployed cautiously, adjusted mortar arcs to avoid friendly fire, and reorganized before committing to a push. Each cautious decision added minutes. Each minute allowed the American platoon to withdraw by teams. The private's deception did not defeat the mortars tactically. It disrupted tempo operationally. In small unit warfare, tempo is survival. A force that moves faster than its opponent's decision cycle dictates the outcome. A force that hesitates forfeits initiative. By moving between abandoned foxholes and varying his firing pattern, the soldier expanded the enemy's perceived threat map. The Germans reacted not to what existed, but to what they believed existed. That belief slowed them. Slowing them saved lives. There is no artillery statistic that records that kind of victory. No official battlefield map marking perception altered here. But platoons are measured by who returns at dusk. And this one returned intact. German mortars cut the platoon off. That part was real. The collapse of the withdrawal route was real. The danger was immediate, the exposure undeniable. What changed the outcome was not reinforcement. It was interpretation. The Germans interpreted sporadic, shifting gunfire as layered defense. They interpreted hesitation as caution. They interpreted silence between shots as repositioning, not absence. They acted accordingly. The soldier who stayed behind understood something critical. In battle, the enemy rarely sees the full picture. He reacts to fragments, sound, movement, timing. Control the fragments, and you influence the reaction. He never intended to hold the hill. He intended to hold the illusion long enough. When the mortars stopped and the Germans finally advanced in strength, the slope was already empty. He walked back alone after dark. No one saw him win the fight, because the fight had been won in the enemy's mind. And sometimes, in war, that is the only battlefield that matters.